Great. Thank you very much, Chair, for your gracious introduction. Indeed, my name is Michael Cowling. I am dialing in from Australia. So currently here, it is in the evening, 7 o'clock in the evening, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you about generative AI. I'm just going to hit the share screen button and start sharing my screen. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start my slides first, and then I will share the screen. And I'd encourage you as we go along, please. I am very interested in getting interactivity in the chat. So as we go along, if there's an opportunity to ask a question or to interact on the chat, please do that with me. I'm very interested in having that kind of conversation with you. But hopefully everybody can see my screen now. So, ladies and gentlemen, I was excited to hear the summary of what we're talking about today, because I think what I'm going to talk to you about really fits in well with the overall theme of today, which is about how these tools are used in the classroom and how these tools will be used for future work. So when I was approached for this presentation, I said, well, why don't I talk about practical tips for using AI in education? And as the chair said, I am an educational technologist. That's really what I do. And so I thought the topics that are discussed sort of dovetailed really well with what I am going to focus on, which really is that idea of education and AI and how they connect together. I usually start with this slide, which probably means less to you than it might mean when I put this slide up in Australia, because often people sort of say, well, who is this? Who is this Associate Professor Michael Cowling? Who is he and why is he presenting to us? And if people recruit me to come and present to an audience, it's usually for one of a couple of different reasons. Number one is that I won a teaching award a few years ago here in Australia from Universities Australia, which was called the 2020 Award for Teaching Excellence in Physical Sciences and Related Studies. I often say that that's the last person that ever won that award, but that's technically because they changed the categories after that, right? So there's no more physical sciences category, but it was great to be recognized as a excellent teacher, a good teacher. Excellent, I guess, is in the title. An excellent teacher in the area. And that's one of the reasons that people often recruit me. The other reason that people often recruit me to come and present to one of these presentations is because I'm, as was mentioned in my introduction, an educational technology scholar. And that's often reflected by the fact that I am the president of an association here in Australia called ASCILITE. And ASCILITE is the Australasian Society for Computing in Learning in Tertiary Education. They require you to learn what ASCILITE stands for when you become president. But it's really Australia's or Australasia's premier society focused on technology-enhanced learning, focused on how technology can be effectively used in the classroom. And so that's how I ended up talking to you about mechanisms for using technology in the classroom. So if you want to know more about what I do, then the best place to do that is to go to www.michaelacowling.com. You can see it on the bottom of the slides there. And you can follow from there onto my official university webpage, or alternatively, my social media. I make a lot of posts on Facebook and on LinkedIn about technology and technology and education and how those things connect together. But interestingly, my doctorate is actually in artificial intelligence. So before I got into technology enhanced learning, I did a PhD in signal processing and neural networks, and a very technical PhD, a computer science PhD, that was really about how those networks were used to recognize non-speech environmental sounds. I then kind of got a little bit sick of it and decided to do something more focused on educational technology. And then last year, at the end of 2022, a tool came along, and and you've probably heard people talk about this yesterday at the conference. ChatGPT was really the tool that came along and sort of shook things up. And it shook things up because people started to go, this tool has the ability to generate language. And that was new. And that was a little bit different in terms of what we were doing with AI tools previously. And so people, at least in Australia, panicked, right? Oh, goodness me, these tools are going to be used by students. And so sometimes people say to me, and I sometimes get asked on the radio and various other places, well, why is AI having a moment? Why are we all talking about generative AI? And I think the reality is, if we cut through all of the rhetoric and we really talk about the reality of why AI is having a moment, it's about the fact that we're worried that students are going to use it to cheat. And I often say that that the mathematicians are laughing at us, right? Because this has been something that mathematics has had to deal with for a long time. They've had to deal with the fact that students are able to use tools like calculators in order to do their work, or an Excel spreadsheet, or goodness forbid, a tool like MATLAB, or something even more advanced, right, to do mathematical modeling. And they've recognized that these tools don't necessarily mean that the students don't have the skills. These tools just help those students to more effectively do the math in the case of mathematics. But for English, it was relatively new, right? For language, it was relatively new. And so in November 2022, when these tools came out, people started to write articles like the one you see on the screen, which said, the headline here is, ChatGPT essay cheats are a menace to us all. People are worried. People are worried about what these tools are going to be used for. And it's a fair question, because ultimately we're moving now into a situation where these tools are not only being used by students, but are clearly also being used by academics as well, by us. And you can see here on the left-hand side an example of a journal paper that was published in Elsevier that actually clearly contains text that was from ChatGPT. Certainly, here is a possible introduction for your topic. That's what ChatGPT says just before it gives you some text. And so these academics have used this tool to generate this paper, and for whatever reason, it's gotten through the entire review process and has actually been published in an Elsevier journal, Surfaces and Interfaces. And that's concerning. And then even if you get academics looking to do the right thing, so you can see here on the right-hand side is also an Elsevier journal, Nurse Education in Practice. These academics wanted to do the right thing. And so they actually said, well, was a portion of this article actually written by ChatGPT? And should we actually recognize that? Should we attribute that in some way? And it's a really interesting question, which I probably don't have time to get into, because I want to talk to you a little bit more about AI in education and some of those practical tips about what you should do in your particular classroom and the kinds of things that you might think about in your context. But it's definitely something to think about, and it does definitely feel like there is a step change for this type of tool and how it can be used and the kinds of things it can do, as opposed to some of the tools that we might have used in the past. Because ultimately, we've been using technology to support our practice for a long time. All right, I talked about mathematicians with calculators, but even using Word and doing a spell check or a grammar check, or using Grammarly to check your grammar online. All of that is us using a tool to help us with our paper writing, for example. And we never previously thought to ourselves those things need attribution. And so the question becomes, well, is this something that needs attribution? Is this significantly different than the way that this has been done in the past? And I know for a fact that tomorrow you're having Michael Sankey, also from Australia, one of my close colleagues actually from Charles Darwin University. He's coming and he's presenting to you. I suspect that this idea of attribution is something that Michael will probably talk to you a little bit about. So I can get away with not talking about it quite as much. I've got a question for you. And what I want you to do is provide assuming we can do it, there are, yes, reactions in the chat. Go to the participants tab for me and react for me with either a yes or a no, please, as to whether or not you have used this tool for anything that you do in your own academic work. And this is where we get the opportunity to see whether or not how brave people are. And don't worry, I don't think anybody's writing this down, but I would be really interested to see how many ticks we get, which means you have used ChatGPT, and how many crosses we get that say that you haven't used ChatGPT. So I'll give you a moment to tell us whether you've used this tool in your own academic work. And this could be in any way. Maybe it wasn't in a finished paper. Maybe it was just in a, in giving you a start, right? So I'll give you 20 seconds to react. And in the meantime, I'm going to check the chat and see. Oh, we've got an interesting set of messages in the chat. Okay. Oh, it looks like we're getting about 50-50. If I presume that a plus is a yes and a minus is a negative in the chat, which I think is a reasonable presumption. It looks like we're getting about 50-50. Interestingly, when I talk to academics, I get numbers higher than that. I think we're talking, I would anecdotally, 7 in 10 academics that I talk to use this tool. And so the question becomes, well, if we're willing to use the tool, then can we really say to our students that they're not allowed to use the tool? Or do we need to work out ways that we can use the tool effectively in our classroom while still making sure that we assess their learning? And that's essentially what I want to talk to you about a little bit today. So hopefully I've made a convincing argument for you. I want to make one other point before I talk to you a little bit about how AI is used in the classroom. And that one other point is something I think we often assume that people know, but I think is worth spending a couple of minutes talking to you about, which is, what do you mean? What do you mean when you say generative AI? And maybe people in yesterday's sessions have already kind of defined this for you. Maybe you're like, I know exactly what generative AI is. Michael, stop wasting my time. But I want to take a moment because there's a point I want to make, right? And the point I want to make is that one way that we can define AI is by using a whole bunch of really complicated terms, right? And as I said to you, my doctorate was in artificial intelligence. My doctorate is in signal processing and neural networks. So I can explain to you what some of these terms mean. I know what a propagation neural network is I use self-organizing maps during my PhD. I could, if you'd like, explain some of these terms, but the reality is that they're not really that useful. What we need to really understand when we're thinking about generative AI is that it's a little bit different than AI tools that we've used before. And it's in this difference that it caused this panic. Previously, if you were talking about AI, so this is pre-2022, what you were talking about is something like one of these things that's on the slide, right? You were talking about a mechanism for pattern recognition or machine understanding. And that was my PhD. Non-speech environmental sound recognition was my PhD. But there are also systems for image recognition, scene analysis, gait recognition, face recognition, speech recognition, etc. Right? So if you think of your mobile phone, features like Siri that you talk to on your mobile phone, or Face ID that is used to unlock your mobile phone. They're great examples of traditional AI. We also used AI for forecasting and predicting. So things like breast cancer recognition or tsunamis, recognizing different wave heights so that you can predict whether or not a tsunami is coming. Recognizing traffic conditions, like what happens in your GPS in your car. And even the summarization engines that you get, they're called TLDR engines, too long, didn't read. Those engines are often based on this idea of forecasting or predicting. We also have AI adjacent technologies, often get lumped in with AI, but are not really AI. Things like data mining or big data, smart advertising. I wouldn't, as an AI person, I wouldn't call them AI, but they often get lumped in. And then we do also have other technologies that are really traditional AI, like planning systems, which actually existed before neural networks, like chess playing systems, or what video games call AI. So if you talk to one of your kids and they say AI, what they actually mean is the set of rules or regulations that are used to manage the characters in the game that they're playing. And it's not really artificial intelligence because there's no machine learning, there's none of this prediction and forecasting stuff. It's more a set of rules. So we've got all of those, right? And that's pre-2020, November 2022. When we talked about AI, that's really what we meant. I call it traditional AI. But ChatGPT changed things. And generally, the technology is called generative AI. That's usually the term we use. Often when people talk about generative AI, they're really talking about ChatGPT, but there were actually generative AI tools that existed before ChatGPT. One of the most popular was DALL-E, which was actually used for art generation. And since then, we've had tools like Midjourney, for example, and a whole bunch of other tools that are all based on generative AI. If you're using ChatGPT, then you're actually using a subset of that called a large language model, or an LLM for short. But what makes all of these tools really interesting and quite different is that they're based on prediction, or not prediction, sorry, prediction's the wrong word, that's a typo, on persuasion rather than truth. So you go to ChatGPT and you ask it a question and it tells you what it thinks you want it to hear. And that's the important point that I wanted to make to you. That's the point I wanted to get to. That's why I've kind of been doing a little bit of a review here. Is I wanted to make the point that unlike those traditional systems which are based on truth, the generative AI systems are based on persuasion. So they'll tell you what they think you want to hear. Think of it this way, right? The large language model has gone out and it has grabbed all of this data, all of this language from the internet. It's combined it all together into its database. And now when you ask it a question, it goes and has a look at that and tells you, based on that, what you probably want to hear, what it's most likely that you're interested in. And sometimes it's really good and it almost feels like magic, but it's not the truth. Not the same way that the truth comes out of a system like a tsunami warning system, which is based on factual data. It's based on wave heights, right? So it generates a truth or a prediction. The ChatGPT or the generative AI generates something that feels persuasive. And that's why these tools end up with falsities, with things that are not true. And we very quickly came up with a term for those in the world. We call them hallucinations. A hallucination is when a generative AI says something that is not true. But when you understand what the tool's doing and how it's generating the output that it gives to you, the hallucinations make a lot more sense because it's based on that corpus of data that's been pulled in. And if that data is wrong, or if that data contains opinions and things that are not factual, then we have a situation where the output is going to be wrong. But it's probably what you expected to hear. And so I wanted to make that point very clearly because I think understanding that is very important for people. And actually, I posted to LinkedIn about it today because I think we need to spend more time educating people on what these tools do and how they work. And it's in understanding how they work that you start to be able to think about, well, how am I going to use this effectively in my classroom? How am I going to use this with my students? And so then that leads us to another question. And this is a question that we've been grappling with here in Australia. I don't know what it's like in Kazakhstan, but I strongly suspect you've been grappling with this question as well, which is, do we eliminate the tool or do we embrace the tool? And when I poll people about this in academia, I'm surprised how many academics are actually on board with embracing the tool. They can see value in the tool, probably more than 50% of academics. It's usually the administrators that don't want it. They're worried about the administrative burden of dealing with all the cheaters and all the students that are using it improperly, right? That's the issue. And so that's, I think, though, the first question we need to ask, and any institution needs to ask this question, right? Are we going to embrace it or are we going to eliminate it? And luckily, a lot of institutions have been starting to think about this already, as well as all of the other things that we need to think about, things like misinformation and academic integrity and assessment strategies and how we actually deal with learning on this tool as well. And ultimately, that does lead to lots and lots of questions like, should we regulate the use of this tool? Just like we regulate the use of calculators in the classroom, right? Some exams that we give to students, we say, you're not allowed to use a calculator. Others, we say you are, right? You can do the same kind of thing with a generative AI tool or a large language model. It makes us ask whether or not plagiarism detection tools are useful at all, right? Because we end up in this kind of cat and mouse game with these tools. Turnitin, which is very popular in Australia. Again, I'm not sure in Kazakhstan, but I suspect it's something you guys might know about as well. It's a plagiarism detection tool. Previously, it compared student assignments to other student assignments. Now, it often will give you an AI score as well. They've been kind of trying to work out how to make that work. And then the last question, the bit that I kind of want to focus on here is whether or not students should be taught how to use the tool. And the reality is that Turnitin has gotten a kind of mixed reputation so far. Again, we're talking about 18 months since these tools came out, and Turnitin launched a tool to recognize these AI written pieces of prose pretty early on in the piece. I think around about this time last year, they launched their AI detection tool, but very quickly, a lot of people reported that it didn't actually work very well. And I'm sure you may have heard anecdotal stories from students about this tool not working well. And here's an article from the Australian press. This is the ABC News, specifically with international students and researchers calling out the fact that AI-generated text might be inaccurate, and those AI-generated AI. And what I hear from universities now is that they're very hesitant to use this tool because it actually causes a lot of student stress and a lot of student appeals. And there's not a lot of value in actually doing that. And so what we're starting to see here in Australia, at least, is this idea that instead what we should do is we should educate our students. And so my argument to you is actually that you should embrace this tool, but you should embrace this tool in a moderated way by letting students know whether or not this tool is appropriate for use in your particular classroom. And my exemplar for it is a university here in Australia, which is the University of Sydney. And the University of Sydney here in Australia proposes a two-lane approach to assessment design for generative AI. So when you're designing your assessment, make a decision, right? Are you designing your assessment to not use generative AI, in which case you should tell the students that this is a lane 1 assessment and that the assessment you're writing for your course is lane 1. In other words, we don't want you to use generative AI for this assessment? Or are you designing your assessment to be enhanced with AI and for students to engage responsibly with AI to actually do that assessment, in which case we call that a lane 2 assessment? And I really like this model, and I particularly like the note at the bottom where USyd recognizes that they do try to make sure that most of their assessments are lane 2, but they also recognize that there's going to be some assessment that we do that is a lane 1 assessment that we can't use generative AI to generate that assessment. And so I would recommend that you have a think about this model, because my anecdotal evidence from students is that that's what they want, right? We did the roundtables last year here in Australia, and students said, we just want to know whether we're allowed to use it or not, right? And so lane 1 and lane 2 allow you to do that. I've also seen this model represented as traffic lights, red assessment, yellow assessment, green assessment, and I'll show you some models of that in a second. I've seen it various other ways as well. But the idea is ultimately we're educating students about this assessment and how it is, whether or not they're allowed to use these tools, right, ahead of time. So that's my first recommendation to you is think about that. Think about embracing the tool, but also educating your students. If you don't like that model, here's another couple of models that you might decide to use instead. So you might have listened to me and said, I like the idea, I don't love the model, right? And the first model I'm going to show you is a bit self-serving. This is a model proposed by my doctoral student. His name is Josiah Coe. And he proposed a model for collaborating with AI in education for better student-teacher reconnection. And the model is actually pretty simple. He calls it the teacher AI spectrum. And the basic idea is when you're designing your assessment, recognize that generative AI tools are really good at things like procedural tasks and knowledge recall tasks and knowledge explanation tasks, but are less good at creativity and inspiration, and in particular, pastoral care, looking after our students. And Josiah's argument is that what we should do is we should mix together both. And we should recognize what the tool is good for, and we should design tasks that involve knowledge or procedure to incorporate generative AI, and to a task that involve inspiration or creativity to not incorporate generative AI. And so this just gives you a framework for thinking about the different things that you do in your classroom and how much generative AI you'd like to put into them so that we as a teacher can collaborate with generative AI. Josiah sort of makes an argument that generative AI could be a really good teaching assistant for us if we let it. Another model you might like, and this one is actually from Mike Perkins in the UK, is this one here. And this is kind of the traffic lights that I was talking to you about before. And you can actually download a free ebook with this model in it from Leon Furz's website. So the second author, Leon Furz, who is actually the PhD student on the project. You can download this model here. And again, it gives you an idea of how you should build your assessment for your class, all the way from no AI. AI must not be used at any point during the assessment, to full AI, which is you can use AI however you'd like in the assessment. And then in the middle, using AI for some components, but not others. And what Mike and his colleagues actually do with this tool is they actually, again, give it to students ahead of time and say to those students, hey, where these are the places we're happy for you to use or not use AI in your class. And we'd like you to report back when you send in an assessment as to what places you use the AI. So it kind of comes back to attribution again. So there's another one for you. The last one that I'm going to show you is this model here. And there's actually two parts to this, both written by the same person. So the person in that I'm talking about is Jason Lodge. Jason Lodge is an academic in Australia. I'm sorry, all my examples are Australian because of where I'm from. But Jason did a couple of really interesting things. Number one is he developed a framework for using generative AI in schools. And that's this framework here. The link is down the bottom here on the slides. If you just look up Australian framework for generative AI in schools, then you'll find this framework here. It is for primary schools and high schools. It is for elementary and secondary education, but I think is still really, really useful in terms of identifying some of those key concepts that we're interested in when we're thinking about our students. And you can see humanity and social well-being, for example, which is something that Josiah talks about, pastoral care, transparency and fairness, which is something that Perkins talks about, being transparent with our students, and then other components as well. So I think this is a really good one-pager that gets you to think about generative AI in schools. And Jason was able to get this used by the majority of schools in Australia as a framework for using generative AI in schools, which I thought was pretty impressive. If you want something that is more academic and more about tertiary education, then Jason also wrote this report here for the Australian Tertiary Education regulator, and they're called TEXA. So if you Google assessment reform for the age of artificial intelligence, you'll find this report which was written November last year, which gives six recommendations for how we reform assessment in this age of AI. You'll see some of this stuff in there as well, because Jason, like me, believes that the crossover between secondary and tertiary education, it definitely exists. But you'll also find some stuff that is a little more specific to tertiary education. And so there's a couple of different resources that you might want to look at, but hopefully you can see the theme I'm going for here, which is establishing some frameworks and some models for thinking about what's happening in your own classroom experience. So that kind of gets us close to what I wanted to talk to you about today. It gives you some stuff that you can look up and some various models that you might use to really think about what's happening with generative AI in your particular classroom context. But it doesn't get us everything, right? Because ultimately there's lots of other things that we might want to think about in regards to generative AI and how it's used in our classroom. And there's things I haven't even touched on, things like equity. What happens if a student doesn't have access to this tool, right? What about the fact that this tool might or might not be used in an environment outside of a place where we can actually monitor them? So it's great to say don't use this tool in at all, but what if our students don't are writing their assignment somewhere where we can't actually check on that, right? And there's a whole bunch of other things that we can think about as well. And so I'm going to point you towards a really odd resource, right? And this odd resource is a school teacher here in Australia called Miriam Scott. And Miriam Scott works for a school, but she also produces heaps of resources in relation to generative AI in schools. And she does a really good job at sort of breaking them down and describing them. And so I'm going to suggest that you go and have a look at Miriam's website, which is here. It's called scottybreaksitdown.com. And she does things like this picture here on the left, where she really spends some time breaking down how these tools work. I know it's an odd resource. It's a secondary school teacher. Miriam does some great work, and I can't recommend it highly enough. It's some great stuff. And so if you kind of didn't buy into some of the stuff that I was talking about already, or there were other concerns that you want to touch on, then Miriam, you might have spent some time talking about it. But I do want to recognize, as I said just before, that there is a lot of other stuff, right, that we need to think about here. And there are questions that we haven't addressed. Things like, is using ChatGPT cheating? How might ChatGPT and other tools affect our broader curriculum? What are they going to mean for our English curriculum in general? And then I've kind of answered the second one, which is what models exist for assessment. There are actually a few starting to come out, right? But the first one is particularly interesting and perhaps a little philosophical. And I do often get asked that question, well, is this tool cheating? And my answer, which may be controversial, is no, as long as students have the ability to feed in the right prompts and evaluate the output of the tool, it's not cheating, because ultimately they're just using it as a tool. And it's really no different than using a calculator or a spreadsheet or something. So as long as they can write the prompts and they can evaluate the output, why does it matter what happens in the middle? And you might agree with that, you might not agree with that, I'm not sure. One more thing that I want to talk about, and I'm conscious that I'm going a little a little ahead of time, so I'm gonna very quickly well, actually two more things that I want to talk about, so I'm gonna do them very quickly. Number one is one more model that I just feel like I have to mention to you as you're thinking about designing your assessment in your classroom is this model here. And this model here is the design-based thinking or the design-based research model, which is a model that is often used in research. DBR is the research version of the model. Design-based thinking or design thinking is the more generic version of the model. And the reason I bring up this model is because it describes a way for students to design assignments, which I think is really useful for us when we start to think about tools like ChatGPT. Because ultimately, if you look at that model, there are 4 stages in the model, right? There is investigating, designing, producing, and evaluating. And ChatGPT is quite good at the designing and the producing. So these two in the middle. It's not very good at the investigating, and is really not very good at the evaluating. Once you understand how the tool works, you know why that's the case. And so I often recommend this as a model for you to think about your assessment, because if you design an assessment in relation to design thinking principles, you can very much design an assessment where you encourage students to investigate and evaluate as part of their process. And because it's part of their process, you can prescribe that they don't use the tool for those steps. And even if they do use the tool for those steps, it probably won't do a great job, right? It's not a foolproof solution, but it gets us some way towards helping to work ChatGPT and other generative AI tools into our classroom. One other thing I want to mention to you before we finish. I often get asked by academics, well, great, Michael, you say that lots of us already use this tool, and you told me that lots of you already use this tool, about 50% of you based on my rough back of the envelope calculation. So what if we really want to double down and use this tool? What's the kinds of things that we can do as academics to use this tool? And my recommendation of the one that I think you should look up is a tool called Cogniti. Once again, offered by the University of Sydney here in Australia. They're definitely our premier university for thinking about these kinds of tools here in Australia. And what Cogniti does is it actually generates feedback for us as academics. And so you can go to Cogniti and you can write rough feedback for a student assignment, and Cogniti will write some nice flowery feedback that you can give to your students. So you might go in and write, this assignment has really crappy references. And Cogniti will come back and say, you need to work on your referencing style for this assignment. Please focus on more academic references and make sure that you reference correctly in text. So it'll generate feedback based on a generative AI model based on what you type in. Whenever I say that to academics, they get really excited because they go, oh yeah, that's really kind of something that would suit us. That would be great. So I'd encourage you to go and have a look for that kind of tool. I also hear that it is really good at writing reference letters for students. So if you've got a student that wants you to write them a reference, and we often do as academics, then ChatGPT is really good at doing that. But don't tell anybody that I said that. That gets me, I think, pretty close to the end. I know that I've given you a lot to think about, right? And what I tried to do here is I tried to give you a whole bunch of things that you might look up, that you might engage with, so that you can start to think about how you might actually use ChatGPT and generative AI practically in your classroom. And so hopefully I gave you some things to think about. Once you think about it, I want you to let me know. So please reach out to me on various social media, like, for example, X, formerly Twitter. on Facebook or on LinkedIn. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. And alternatively, if you're feeling a bit old-fashioned, there's my email address at the bottom of the slide, and you can email me as well. So if you do this, if you do a design-based research or a design thinking-based assessment task, if you use one of those frameworks to start thinking about what you're doing in your classroom, please reach out to me and let me know how it went. And that, I think, brings me to the end. Just to finish off, there are my websites. The best one by far and away for you would be the second one, which is michaelacowling.com. If you go there, you can follow me on social media and find me talking about generative AI a lot. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to turn off the PowerPoints, and I hopefully left a couple of minutes for questions if anybody has any questions or there's anything interesting in the chat, a lot of which is in Russian, so I might need somebody to translate.
Professor Cowling, спасибо огромное.
Professor Cowling, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much for voicing the thoughts that circulate in the minds of all us who have just started using ChatGPT, and even those who have already tried using it. I believe that the design thinking and using generative AI, shaping your assessments, using ChatGPT and other AI bots for assessments and now classrooms. I think all of us have different thoughts about that. We have a number of questions from the audience. First, can you refer to examples of ratios, percentage-wise? What percentage of students or pupils use AI in their daily and academic activities? We are especially interested in how this is widespread about the first graders in universities. Maybe you have any surveys, maybe you know how many first grade university students or other grade students, how often they use AI, ChatGPT or any other chatbot based on generative AI.
My experience is that the self-reporting is low, right? So when you ask students whether or not they use this tool, they all go, no, I don't use this tool, right? But what we see in reports from things like the Turnitin tool in the past, and even examples like the publicly available examples that I showed right at the very beginning, is that more people use the tool. So there's, if you go and have a look at the journal that I mentioned, which is Chattel, there have been some surveys, but I think those surveys underrepresent the amount of students that actually use this tool. Because think about it, if you go to students and you say to students, hey, do you use these tools? They're all going to say no, right? They're all going to say no. So I think the numbers are underrepresented. But no, I don't have any percent numbers to hand, but I think we need to be very careful about using those kinds of survey results anyway.
And what about the published statistics? What are the figures? I mean, if you compare your own considerations, your own vision of this underreporting, and what is officially reported, by the way? Can you refer to some figures, please?
I don't know the numbers offhand. It's a fairly new area, so I can't really report. I'd be happy to take the question on notice and come back, but yeah, I don't know offhand. Sorry.
Спасибо.
Okay, good. Thank you. There's another question. Can you give us examples of the assignments to be given to students by using, for them to use generative AI, do you have any homework for students to do so that within the assignment they would have to use generative AI to perform your task?
Great question. A great way to use generative AI, if you decide that you're going to go for the green box or Mike Perkins model, full AI use in your classroom, one of the great ways to get students to use it is to get them to use generative AI to generate a response and then evaluate or mark the response for you and tell you what they think of it. So they provide you the response and then they provide you with their evaluation of the response. It's kind of like peer learning, but where the peer is a machine, right? And so what we're doing there is we're essentially assessing those evaluative skills, the synthesis and evaluation skills, the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, by giving them a case study, a dynamically generated case study. So you can do that, but you can't do that for all assessments because sometimes we just want to ask students about the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And in that situation, evaluation and synthesis doesn't work.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. Professor Cowling, yesterday one of the speakers said here that using ChatGPT for educational purposes would not be a good idea, that special platforms for educators have to be used, the platforms based on generative AI, but tailor-made to educators. Do you agree?
What do you think? No, look, I think I think it's difficult to ban technology. Here in Australia, we have recently talked about banning mobile phones in classrooms. And I don't think that makes a lot of sense. I think when we get out into the real world, we use this technology. And I think we need to encourage students to learn to use this technology for their future work, right? Which you've got somebody talking about next. So I would encourage instead to get students to responsibly use this technology. And for that reason, I think we need to coach students on how to use it responsibly. And look, so far, again, we've got to be careful with self-reporting, but so far when you say to students, what do you want to do with this technology or what's your main concern? They will say, we just want you to help us understand how to use it responsibly, right? So they want us to teach them how to use the technology. So no, I'm not a big advocate. And I think it's a cat and mouse game. I don't know if you use that term in Russian or in Kazakhstan, but you're always chasing to make sure that you're dealing with trying to ban it. I don't think that works.
Спасибо огромное.
Thank you so much. There's a comment. I understand that we are behind schedule, but we are having a very nice discussion right now in the chat. And there's a comment. The comment says, I asked my first graders whether they use ChatGPT. 6 out of 19 students reported they used the ChatGPT to make their homework. They're using the question and answer model. This is a good comment. And in the follow-up, probably students are shy to report that they use ChatGPT in their activities because they believe that using generative AI is cheating. How can we change their attitude to this tool? What would you advise?
Yeah, as soon as I heard 6 out of 19, I thought to myself, so 30% told you that they were using the tool. I reckon 60 to 70% actually used the tool. I mean, how can we change their attitude? We need to stop demonizing the technology. We need to let them know that it's okay to use technology because we use it. We use it. Many academics use this technology. We all use ChatGPT. We saw the examples of papers where people use it. So I think we need to let them know it's okay. But that's a big cultural shift. I think that's a difficult cultural shift. And being brutally honest with you, here in Australia, we're headed in the wrong direction. We're moving more towards banning technology and doing what your previous speaker said and trying to put walls up. Whereas I actually think we just need to let them know that it's okay in the right circumstances.
Профессор Коулинг, а смотрите, какая ситуация.
Professor Cowling, you see, Yelena in the chat describes another situation, 45 students, none of them even generates images. However, she, university professor, proposed to them to use generative AI to make their homework, and she offers them to use generative AI to look for information, but they are not doing it. So this is another extreme. So we want them to use it, and they say, no, we would like to do business as usual. You lecture, we answer. You lecture, we answer. It's a very easy routine, right? So what are we going to do with such students?
I think I could do another hour presentation. I could talk for a long time about that because I think that's a genuine concern. I think we run the risk of picking up, starting to expect students to use this tool and then not recognizing that some students are unwilling to use this tool. And here in Australia, often we talk about students that are from lower socioeconomic groups that don't have the money or the ability to use this tool. Elena's talking about students that just don't want to use the tool. And I think it is a genuine concern that if we get used to students using this tool, we expect a better quality piece of assessment because we expect that they've all used the tool. And so then students like Elena's students are disadvantaged because they didn't use the tool. I don't have a good answer. I think that is a big problem that Elena has identified with the students. And the question she needs to ask is, does she just not use the tool, or does she try and encourage students to use the tool because the results might be better?
Спасибо огромное, спасибо за эту сессию.
Thank you very much for this Q&A session. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you for spending your evening with us. And thank you for your practices, for your experience, your openness, and for sharing your contact details. I believe that our audience will be happy to join the discussion. And wishing you all the best. Have a nice evening. We had Michael Cowling, Dr. Cowling with us. Thank you very much and goodbye to you, sir.